I want to first state, because it's recently in the last few hours become an issue, that we are an ad hoc. We're not a standing committee, so that some of the questions that have been raised about transparency really don't fit us. Our mission and purpose is very limited, and we don't have a majority of the commissioners participating, so we don't have to follow the Brown Act. And there will be other opportunities for those who wish to comment on our recommendations around the pursuit policy, for them to speak directly to the commission or to the City Council Public Safety Committee or to the full council before it's finalized. So there's a process forward, and some number of people have indicated that they might want to tune in and listen to us tonight, and we hope they do. But the participants in the discussion will be the three commissioners when Ricardo Garcia gathers, and then the other members of this ad hoc when they arrive. There's Commissioner Ricardo Garcia now, who's just joined us. Welcome, Commissioner Ricardo Garcia Acosta.
Thank you, Commissioner Rawls. Apologies for my tardiness.
No problem. So I thought that what we might start with is some comments from Professor Alport on the study that he sent us, dealing with the county and the city of I'm forgetting the name of it now.
Roanoke.
Roanoke, yeah, and then some general comments about the pursuit policy across the country that he is aware of in terms of what's happening around pursuit policy. We'd appreciate that if you could enlighten us, Professor Alport.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. It's late night for me and early evening for you, but I did send along the study that I had nothing to do with it, but I was aware of it, that the New York Law School Police Project did a few years ago in Roanoke. And the reason it's interesting to me is that its findings basically found the same thing we did 30 some years ago in Orlando and a few other cities, that when we studied the impact of a changing policy on crime, they basically showed that it had no impact. In other words, if you change from a judgmental policy to a restrictive policy and reduce the number of pursuits, you're really not impacting the crime. The reason it's so important is most of the research that we did was back in the 90s, early 2000s, and it's hard to say that those data are still relevant in today's world. But the New York, the New York Police Project, NYU Law School that did the study in Roanoke, kind of updated what we did years ago and found the same thing. So I'm comfortable with those results. And to Mr. Rawls' comments or questions about what's going on around the country, it's important to look back in the kind of the historical context. I was brought in, I don't even remember the year, during the consent decree in Oakland to write the policy. And I worked with the judge, I worked with the city police department, I worked with the monitor, and we ended up negotiating the violent crime only policy, which was at the time and still is what we call a restrictive policy that yeah, it does restrict pursuits to violent crimes, but it also saves lives and saves the department a lot of angst by not chasing minor offenders and ending up in collisions, injuries, and deaths. We've seen in the state of Washington, they several years ago passed a law that all policies had to be violent crime policies, and then this year reversed that, and I think just last month made it possible for departments to reduce and change their policies, and some have gone back to the chase until the wheels fall off approach. And I testified to the legislature that they're basically signing the death warrant of people who are going to be killed, who are going to be severely injured and killed in these pursuits for relatively minor offenses. The bottom line is looking at the government interest in apprehending someone and the risk created by the chase, knowing that it's more likely than not that when the police quit chasing, the suspect is going to quit driving in a very reckless fashion. We know from a study that we did attitudinally with both suspects who fled and officers that suspects will slow down when they feel safe. We then did a study with Star Chase, which has its followers and detractors, but the bottom line is Star Chase showed us with the computerized real-time data that people slow down within 90 seconds on a freeway. The time in town is a lot shorter, but the most time they'll spend continuing to flee is a minute and a half once the police quit chasing. So we know the behavior, we know what's going to happen, and I think by asking police officers to analyze a series of variables, I think you had 19 or something in your policy, is not fair to the officer. There's no way a person can go through and analyze those data in such a quick fashion in the heat of the chase. I think it's important that those decisions be made in the boardroom where the chief and his command staff and consultants can think through what's worth it. When should we put our public at risk? What's worth the probability or the possibility of a collision? And when I train officers, I always ask, how would you feel if your 16-year-old daughter were injured in a pursuit by one of your officers chasing someone for a stolen vehicle? And when you start thinking about it that way and making it personal, these pursuits aren't worth it. I think if you really want to dig into what's happening in Oakland, you've got to update these data and do a study that looks at the impact of pursuits on crime and where things are, how many people are really fleeing from the police when they don't chase, and what's the consequence? What difference does it make? Because until we know that, raising the risk to the public, in my opinion anyway, doesn't make sense. So that's kind of the general overview. We're seeing, we conducted a major study with the Police Executive Research Forum that I think, Mr. Riles, you said you sent to people. That consensus from the police chiefs and the command staffs from departments all over the country agreed that a violent crime policy, and in fact, only an offense where someone's life was at risk, would be worth chasing. And I think that's kind of the general consensus we're seeing. And the state of Washington, while it changes its law, I think in the next few months, we're going to see a lot more chases. If I remember correctly, I just read yesterday that a police officer died, or 2 police officers died in California due to a chase. That's the worst thing that can happen. And is it worth risking the lives of officers, of the public, for a minor offense? And my answer is no.
The department are moving in the direction of Oakland in terms of this focus on the violent crimes or where a gun is present.
Well, the Bureau of Justice Statistics a few years ago put out a report that for the first time there were more restrictive policies than these judgmental policies. And yes, it seems that the country has been moving. Now, remember, there's 18,000 police departments, but the major cities have certainly gone to the restrictive violent crime policies. Most major cities have that policy. And some of the smaller ones in the sheriff's departments are more likely to chase. But even some of the state highway patrol departments have restricted their pursuits because they realize that chasing is just not it's not going to end well. And if they can't justify a continued chase, just because someone's speeding, it's going to end up costing an enormous amount of money. And then you start looking at the social costs of lives and families and court cases. It just doesn't make sense.
Questions from any of the other commissioners or from the officers? Go ahead, Lieutenant Fable.
Hey, good evening, Commissioner Riles and everyone on the thing. First of all, sir, I really want to commend the research of the paper that you provided us, very in depth with the police agency, and I really like the table where they provided the matrix. I thought the matrix, which essentially denoted the level of the offense versus the outcome of the pursuit versus risk factors, was very telling. And I also noted that the data, forgive me if I pronounced the city wrong, Renecki, and the type of crimes that they were dealing with and the outcome of the changes in the pursuit policies, I thought it was all very good. My question for consideration was that Renecki is, on the particular source that I utilized in terms of the crime scale for cities was a 22.7. It was literally exactly average. Whereas the city of Oakland, in terms of the violent crime ratio, was a 75 out of a 22.7. So we have inordinately higher violent crime. And so I was wondering, on your expertise, if you had stated that maybe we need to research some more of the data and how it correlates with a city like Oakland that has a dramatically higher violent crime rate in relation to the matrix as it put out, because I do agree with you that chasing for lower offenses is inherently dangerous and risk versus reward is often not measured. But maybe there are some offenses that are in the mid-tier that we currently do not pursue for based on our current crime statistics that could be considered on an updated study. I would just like to know everybody's thoughts.
Let me respond first, because I think that's a really important point. Oakland may be different from Roanoke. And I would assume it is, and certainly based on the crime statistics, is a more violent city and county than what we see in that Virginia study. But that said, we're seeing around the country in other cities with high crime rates, as you have in Oakland, the alternatives to pursuits. I mean, you have these gosh, what are they called? The street, when they, the kids are out there just doing donuts and street races.
Sideshows,
Yeah. And a lot of the departments have now set up cameras and even using drones and other technology to capture who's doing what and dealing with it, in real time. Chasing is not the answer. Technology is the answer. And how you use that technology. And I think it's Chula Vista. Well, I met the chief at one of the conferences a year ago, and she was telling me that they've been using drones to observe all sorts of activities and capturing on video who's doing what, and then dealing with it afterwards, which seems to have a very large deterrent effect. To your point of other offenses, one of the most controversial one is a DUI. If you're suspecting someone of DUI, and there's nothing worse than a drunk driver. But as I was told at a MAD conference once from a woman whose husband had been killed by a drunk driver during a chase, she said there's nothing worse than a drunk driver except one being chased by the police. Because if you're not driving well at 40 and you're trying to escape, what kind of driving are you doing at 80 or 90? I mean, it's one of those horrible catch-22s where no matter which decision you make, there's going to be a loss. And the question is, do you want to let this person go and try to apprehend them later, or maybe not apprehend them at all, or do you want to risk the probability of a serious collision or death? So I think that the line in the concrete, not in the sand that can shift and move, but the line in the concrete has to be, unless it's a violent crime, you don't start a pursuit. Even with a violent crime, you wait and see, you know, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in a school zone, you think it's appropriate to chase someone? It just doesn't make sense.
Commissioner Jackson and then Lieutenant Urquiza.
Thank you very much. And I too want to appreciate both you, Commissioner Riles, for connecting with Mr. Alpert and looking at the data, because as a community leader, my concern is who gets hurt in the process. And I did hear you say police officers were killed recently, but we also know that community members tend to be killed. And what for, right? So I'm just appreciating the data and the fact that it's all saying the same thing. Even though crime is rogue, pursuit does not sound like it's the answer. So thank you very much.
Lieutenant Urquiza and then Commissioner Ricardo Garcia Acosta.
So I just want to say that I definitely echo your response on the need for a technological infrastructure build out. I think the city of Oakland is really doing a great job of embracing modern technologies. Sergeant Urquiza could certainly talk about some of those. And a really neat technology that's under consideration by the city right now that could dramatically reduce the need for pursuits as a fixed wing aircraft. So I echo your sentiment that technology is a great tool to reduce pursuits, increase public safety.
Sir, let me add, I'm probably the only one who's ever been funded by the Justice Department to study aircraft in pursuits. And as expensive as it is and was back when I studied it, and it's higher today, I was riding one time with aircraft in Miami, and I can't remember the cost per hour, but it was high. And yeah, we went to some crime scenes and we did help the officers find people. But one thing that bothered me the most was we were out, this was out in the Everglades, but you know, every city has these areas that aren't patrolled well. And an officer had stopped someone, and you know, we were there with a helicopter shining the light, and the cop got back in the car and said, "Thanks for being there. I was a little concerned when we first stopped this guy, what was going on." And you can't put a price on that. I mean, officer safety is critical, and protecting officers who are doing their job, the fixed wing, the helicopters, these drones, they can all help. But being there and making that officer feel safe, and you know, who knows, maybe this guy would have taken off if the helicopter hadn't been there. I just can't think of a better way to deal with this issue than technology.
Commissioner Garcia Acosta, and then Joseph McAuliffe from the Inspector General's office.
Thank you, Commissioner Riles. Also want to extend my gratitude to Mr. Alpert. That was very important and fascinating stuff to look over today. And I just, you know, on face value, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. It just makes sense, right? Especially as a community member, somebody that lives in the flatlands, somebody that, you know, I don't want to, you know, get mowed down crossing the street, going to the store, right, one day, nor my kids or any of my community members. And so I'm very sensitive to that. I also am very sensitive to the fact that if we don't do something or explore other options, there's essentially a cheat code that's happened since post-pandemic, whether it's in smash and grabs, whether it's in taking off, knowing that they're not going to get pursued, whatever these policies are, word gets on the streets and they exploit them. And so I'm trying to figure out ways, and technology was the one question I was going to ask you about, is just in your experience in different modalities or different variations of technologies and how they've been employed, because the last thing we're trying to do too is also advocate to have our communities over surveilled and I could just, and it's quite terrifying to me to think that drones are just going to be hovering over our streets of Oakland, right, 24/7, right? And what are those costs for that, right? And is there a need for that? So I'm actually wondering if like there is a middle ground somewhere of you seen in other cities or in other examples of technology where, I guess what I'm trying to get at, where it's like, okay, somebody takes off, we can't pursue. Can you trigger an immediate drone response? And in those very, very specific situations, like how can we manage that surveillance footprint in a way where it's very specific to things like freeway shootings, to high-speed chases? I mean, heck, I just came from the Grand Canyon, taking a family trip to the Grand Canyon, and there's roundabouts on every other corner in that damn state. And I'm wondering, like, what's the public investment of just having roundabouts in every corner in Oakland? And yeah, we might have to go around little roundabouts and slow everything down, but you're not having any high-speed chases or sideshows in a roundabout. So, I'm also thinking of just like public infrastructure along with variations of technology without over surveilling folks too. It's a really hard balance that what we're being asked to task right now. Obviously, a lot of eyes, a lot of political pressure. But I will say, as somebody that is an advocate for community, advocate for young people, and don't want to see young people getting over criminalized, and overly locked up, right? That more than they already are. We have to do something, because there is a cheat code that's on the streets of Oakland. I'm sure folks from the PD department would agree with this, is that once that word gets out on the street, then it's like, all right, well, if we all do it, they're not going to catch all of us, right? And it's just like a cheat code, a video game now. And that in turn has now had negative impacts on public safety and on the overall feeling of lawlessness in our city. And so the spotlight's on us. I encourage us all to continue to keep on diving and peeling off these different layers and figuring out how we can strike that balance between public safety, not over criminalizing our communities that are already over criminalized, not over surveilling our communities, but how do we look at the nuances of technology and the advancements of technology to really support something, maybe even if it's just slightly different. I'm torn, because I'm appreciating this conversation, because I'm trying to figure out what is that balance, what does that look like, and at this point I'm just kind of pontificating, so I'll just end there and pass it on.
Look, those are critical issues, and I never meant to think or to say that there should be drones up 24/7. And again, the chief in Chula Vista was explaining to me that they've got several, I think 10 or 12 drone zones in the city. It's a smaller city, but if there is a chase, yeah, they can set a drone up. And then if the drone can't keep up or runs out of power, another drone can follow. So yeah, it's very specific. It's the drone operators. Yeah, they're not out there to look generally at things. They're very specific things. So you're absolutely right. And one of the other issues when we had the same problem in New Orleans, and we created a code, and I don't know if Oakland has one, but there's now a code in New Orleans, and I've seen it used in other cities. If someone takes off from you, a police officer initiates a traffic stop or a felony stop, and someone takes off, there's a new code now. So you know how many people do this. Right now, it's a myth. Right now, we don't know if people or these kids are just going to take off. So I think there's a lot of study that has to be done in your city to determine exactly the nature of your problem. And one of the things that we need to find out is, are people taking off at a higher rate? What we see normally and across the country is, yeah, look, there are kids that will take off from the police. When you change a policy, there'll be a short spike, but it'll come back to normalcy. I don't know what's happening in Oakland. I can't answer that question. And without the proper research, you don't know. Now, if there is a big problem and people are just taking off helter skelter, well, then yeah, then you've got to figure out a different position. I still think technology is the answer because chasing on the streets is just going to get someone killed.
Joseph McCullough, and then Sergeant or Lieutenant Orge. Yeah, I have difficulty with your names, sir. Orquesa. Go ahead.
There you go, Commissioner. You got it.
Go ahead, Joseph. We're not hearing you, Joseph.
My bad. I hit mute on my microphone. I wasn't here at the beginning, so I'll give my brief little introduction. I'm Joseph Connor McCullough. I'm the policy analyst for the Office of the Inspector General. So I was looking through the study you provided, and I understand you're not one of the listed authors on that study, but I still think it's interesting, and I think it's worth digging into that a little bit. And this first question really goes off of what Commissioner Garcia Acosta was talking about. Chief Jones in Roanoke City, which is kind of counterintuitively the larger of the two jurisdictions looked at. Roanoke City is about twice the size of Roanoke County in terms of officers. Cited an increase in suspects fleeing as an explicit reason for their reversion from their most restrictive policy to a marginally less restrictive policy. Do you know if that was ever actually verified in any sense? The study kind of mentioned it and then kind of never went back to it. There's nothing in there that would really look at whether or not that is the case.
Yeah, my understanding is that's anecdotal. It's not empirical. That a lot of people think people are fleeing at different rates, and we just don't know. That's why we created this special code in New Orleans so we could track it and see if people are fleeing at different rates, either over time specifically or for specific reasons. So my understanding in Roanoke, it was anecdotal, as it is in most places.
The other thing that kind of jumped out at me about that is, and I have a lot of comments, but I'll stick to the two that I think are most jumped out to me as like questions, or in this case, a concern. Figure 8. So the last figures in the paper are arrest rate by offense type. And for some reason, they stop at month 1 of 2017, which is the same month that Roanoke City reverted to the less strict policy. I really don't, something like that being in the paper is like a pretty big concern to me, as just like essentially missing data. There is this time period where there was a policy change and the data was available, but it's not present. So that kind of jumped out to me as like really like a time hacking, a T-hacking concern of, is that data for Roanoke City reverting from restrictive to bounded saying something that kind of contradicts the conclusions of the paper as a whole? Or like, is that a concern for you that data isn't in there?
Well, again, I had nothing to do with the study. I didn't design it and conduct it. I saw that as well. I don't know the answer. That would be a question for the authors. But what we've seen in other cities, particularly Atlanta, that after a horrendous series of collisions, the chief, this a few years ago, basically said no pursuits until we did a study. And what we found out during the time when she had terminated any pursuit was the city would simply call in the state, and the Georgia Highway Patrol would just chase everyone. So I kind of thought that might happen in Roanoke, but I just don't know. I don't know.
that's another thing that, kind of just speaking away from this study, I have thought about. So you mentioned looking into that question of, are individuals fleeing more? That is something that I will probably talk to my boss. I'll talk to acting Chief Jones or acting IG Jones about that, because I could probably, using departmental incident report narratives, could probably do some annoyingly complicated analysis to get that done.
Well, yeah, I would be concerned because we tried that in New Orleans, and until we created the new code where officers would call it in, it got really confusing. And I'm happy to send you or put you in touch with the captain in New Orleans who had created that, because I think they've really resolved the issue very well.
I feel like I could approximate it, and this is something that Lieutenant Urquiza would know better than I, but I imagine the arrest or the incident report narratives will mention if a suspect fled, and if that's the case, it doesn't have to be like coded particularly as that. I could go through, do some annoying text analysis, and take advantage of the fact that I have my computer science minor, as unfortunate as that is for me and my workload sometimes. But in regards to something like that, that brings up like the similar situation in Oakland right now, where looking at data from 2024 is not realistic, because 2024 has kind of a de facto policy change where Oakland has already kind of de facto permitted more pursuits because California Highway Patrol is here, and California Highway Patrol operates by their own rules and will pursue you for anything they want.
Yep. And that's what happened in Georgia. So look, if you can approximate it, it's better than nothing. I still think the code would be helpful, but the lieutenant might know better than any of us. And look, this is the problem, looking at from 20,000-foot view that I'm giving you from around the country to focusing down on your specific city without doing the research there. I'm kind of giving you a global view.
Yeah. And we over here in the IG's office are trying to get on that research. It's a bit weird over in our neck of the woods right now with some internal changes, but that is something that I would be interested in looking at, and I am confident I could get something. It would be a tremendous pain, because anything that is text analysis is just an absolute slog. But I mean, well, I can handle absolute slugs.
Thank goodness for AI that can help you with all of that.
Computers make this a lot easier. Turns out I can't read 11 million incident reports, but Python can.
Yeah, exactly.
Lieutenant Urquiza.
Thank you, everyone, for having me. And I'll make that a little easier for you. We do track all our failure to yield. So if there is a failure to yield, the supervisor is usually calling that in and then logging that with communications. So that might be an easy starting point for you on that one. I know there's some in the group here today that weren't at the last meeting that I was at, so I'll give a very brief background. I've been at the department for almost 10 years now, but I also was born and raised in Oakland. My family still lives in Oakland. Most of the people that I care about most in the world still live in this city. So I definitely share the feeling of the concern about having 4,000-pound vehicles flying around at high speeds on city streets. And it's not something that I take lightly. For somebody who, when I get home, I generally am walking around in my own neighborhood, and I've seen pursuits go by. I had a CHP pursuit terminate near us the other night. So with that, the thing that I keep hearing from the community, and something that I've shared, is I've never seen it as bad as it is now in Oakland. from growing up here as a kid and then, you know, as an adult, the kind of crime that we're seeing and this transformation from generally proceeds that were generated by drug dealing or narcotics trafficking, a lot of that has transferred into property crime and then and also into robberies and stuff like that. So we've seen a very large increase in those type of crimes, and at the same time, the tools to stop those have decreased. I would agree with you. I don't think pursuits is technically the solution to these problems. There's no one thing that is the solution to these problems. Technology would definitely help. The ability to enforce some of the laws we actually are able to stop people for would definitely help. But at this point, we have to do something. And I would love for there to be zero pursuits. That's just not a reality in the city. And we have to be able to bridge the gap between where we're at now and where we need to be to get the technology or the environmental infrastructure to prevent pursuits or to shorten pursuits. So I'm not here, and I know Lieutenant Felble's not here to try to get more pursuits, but we do need some tool to address this in the short term while we look out to the long term. I grew up in the department in a time where we've had the same pursuit policy up until recently, which was amended by the special order. So I think there is some of the crime that was dissuaded by them knowing that there was going to be potentially could be a pursuit, and some of that stuff has nothing to do with that. But the general air of no accountability is definitely not the option that is working. And we've seen an increase in crime due to that. And then from a personal matter, seeing CHP here as a Oakland police officer, someone who takes a lot of pride in working in the city I grew up in, having to have CHP here to do what in theory should be our job is it like hurts. It bothers me because I think that we do have good officers here that have good training that can do this job and can keep the city safe. But having a solution be bringing in outside help who then don't have that buy-in to the community or the safety of the community and are here basically just running around chasing everything, that I don't think is the solution either. So I would ask for everyone to take a look at this policy and take a look at this topic and not just start with the conclusion that pursuits are dangerous. We know pursuits are dangerous. But we want to find other solutions, but what is the short-term solution and then what's the longer term solution? And then you spoke to the 19 risk factors. I think that's important. I think the officers are good at doing that. And when they're not, that's usually when the supervisor is the one that ends that pursuit. And it should be a constant assessment and reassessment. And like you said, like when you're in a school zone, that's probably never a good time to do a pursuit if school's in session. And that's one of our risk factors, and it's one of the most important risk factors, or in a high pedestrian area and stuff like that. So I think that we should just look at this without just starting with the conclusion and then see, how do we get to where we want to be? And sometimes things are dangerous, but you're not going to solve difficult things by not doing difficult things. So that's just what I would add. And then if there was any questions about specific policy related issues or tracking stuff, I can answer that as well.
Lieutenant, let me just comment that I feel you. I've heard comments like yours from dozens of departments, and I totally agree with it. One of the things we've looked at are prosecutorial issues. We see so many pursuits that the fleeing and eluding is plea bargain, and it's never been enforced. They reduce it down to reckless driving or something, and so the prosecution. And again, I don't know Oakland very well. It's been a long time since I've been out there and worked with you guys. I don't know how your prosecutors deal with those issues. You're right, though. It's a systemic problem. It's not just a police problem. The long term includes all of those concerns. The short term is a much more difficult issue. what do you do to keep these idiots from running from you? If they know that you're not going to chase them and not going to follow up, do you have resources to go look for them after they flee? I mean, there are all sorts of questions that come up that I just don't have an answer for. But if you have the data and you understand what's going on, it's much easier to figure out, all right, do you need a tagging and tracking technology? Do you need cameras that will stop these sideshows? Because we know how we've seen that work in other cities in California, in fact. And how do you get that to work? That's got to be your immediate question, because I agree with you, and then maybe, I don't know, we might disagree, because I think when you start chasing and putting citizens at risk, like you're saying, you don't want your family at risk. Well, I don't want my family at risk. But which risk are we talking about? The risk of a pursuit, or being a victim of a snatch and grab or a violent crime? I don't know the answers, because I don't know your data. But I think that's an important thing to look at before you make decisions and before you change your policies, is to really look at what the data show you.
So I tried to address this in the report on the review by indicating to the council and the Council Public Safety Committee that the department needed their support on doing more of these technical support items for the department, including the fixed wing and the cameras. And that speaks to one of the folks in the chat who are saying that we should not forget the downstream costs of some of these perpetrators getting away and continuing to do harm to the community. We don't want to forget that. We're not forgetting that. We're saying that there are unexplored other ways to get at those perpetrators other than endangering citizens on the street who are innocent. Am I hearing that correctly? Is that being agreed to? Commissioner Garcia Acosta.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Rouse. I did want to highlight, I think you started to reference it a little bit, Commissioner Rouse, that there are some comments in the chat that I wanted to acknowledge, and I believe I saw a hand up in the chat. I'm not sure if that hand up is up anymore. So not sure how you want to go about that. If we want to read out the comments in the chat, we could do that quickly, but then I also, yeah, there is a hand raised in the chat as well too. So I just want to acknowledge the public as well. And then also always have some comments as well, but I did want to first acknowledge.
Why don't you go ahead with your comments?
Okay, great. Thank you. So real quickly, I think the other thing I would like to explore, and before I do that, with all due respect, Mr. Alpert, I also want to be cautious on how we refer to potential people that are in these situations as well too, because I've seen them be anywhere from hardened criminals that just committed homicides taking off to a young kid that is just terrified from, doing something stupid, joyriding in their mom's car, and then they get freaked out when the car hits their lights and they take off, right? So, I think part of what we're dealing with in the nuance is the sensitivity of not knowing who that driver is, right? Or what type of risks are happening. So my question is also, or maybe it's an open-ended question, but just something for us to consider as well as we're looking at these potential tweaks, and definitely would love to hear the public's opinions on this, is, someone, I think maybe Urquiza, you mentioned, pursuits like during school times, right? And I'm wondering if a policy could also be nuance based, or if Mr. Alpert, if you've seen in other jurisdictions, pursuit policies being nuanced to like certain times of the day, right? Like, oh, during the hours of school times from 3 to 6, like, we're not going to pursue folks. But at 2, 3 in the morning, when it's a sideshow and the safety risk and there's not as many general people in the public, oh, we're going after your ass, right? And so, like, I don't know if you've seen that type of nuance in pursuit policies in the past. That's my first question. The second thing I'd also like us all to consider as well is public messaging. And I'm wondering, in other jurisdictions, has there been success in public messaging to the public? Because I would guess, and from my just expertise and working in community and working with folks that may not be making right decisions all the time, that, you know, there's an old saying that, you know, that in a fair exchange, there is no robbery, right? And I think in part of public messaging is, even if we make a slight tweak in how OPD communicates with CHP in the event of a pursuit, or how they're going to be charged from the DA's office in the event of a pursuit, or the fact that if you're pursuing during hours that are after 7 o'clock, oh, we're going hard and we're going to go after you, right? Like, whatever these tweaks are, we need to have billboards, we need to have public messaging, and we need to be able to tell and inform the community, oh, this is a different day and things are going to be different. And I guarantee that as quickly as that cheat code spreads around the community, that, oh man, we could just hit the gas and they're not going to chase us, that is also going to quickly hit the community and also be like, oh, you know what, things are changing, we need to stop doing what we're doing. I know for a fact that people adjust. Folks that are, you know, committing, you know, and making wrong decisions and maybe committing crimes, they adjust. And so I think it's also around how we message. We've heard in many police commission meetings, general public bringing up concerns about OPD politicizing stuff. Oh, I'm not going to arrest you. You're not going to get charged. Oh, I'm not going to pursue you. We can't chase you, right? And we need to also figure out a way to eliminate that. And I'm also, I guess my third thing is figuring out, sorry, I'm thinking of new things as I talk, is the third thing I would also like us to consider and or consider Mr. Alpert's perspective on is there a way to use body cam and or other type of technology to figure out what happens in that little 5-second interaction so that police have no choice but to exhaust all options and not politicize it? And so that because what we're hearing from the community is that they're hearing time and time again, and we've heard this repeated, I wouldn't bring it up if it wasn't a common theme, right? Is the cop saying, oh, well, we're not going to go after that person because we can't chase him anyway. Or we're not going to arrest him because he's not going to get prosecuted. I'm wondering, is there a way that we could like pull body cam footage or something to find out what happens in that 2 to 5 second interval when somebody decides to take off and a cop actually trying to make a reasonable stop and then doing all they can to make that stop, and then, oh, they really did take off, I got to call it in, I got to do the right protocols and stuff, right? How can we also have deterrence? And this is also for, you know, again, I keep on thinking about body cam footage, but it's not always activated, but how do we also have deterrence for our own police to not politicize these policies? Because that's also what hits the streets is, oh yeah, this cop told me they're not even arresting us because they're not going to prosecute us. Next thing we know, we got 50 young people doing the same thing because that hit the street. So I know it's long-winded comments. We don't all have to have answers to them now, but there are things for the commission to consider and for this panel to consider. And I would love to hear some of the public's opinions around that as we continue to explore this. And with that being said, there's a lot of hands up and a lot of folks in the public as well that have their hands up.
I can answer probably the first part of what your question was the nuance. So something that's in our policy and is part of the risk factors is that nuance. Is when a supervisor hears that a unit is behind a robbery vehicle, that is one of the factors that it's traffic volume, it's, you know, pedestrian traffic, and that's constantly being assessed and reassessed and also broadcast over the radio. So if an officer say like, oh, the vehicle's traveling eastbound on International, approaching 73rd Avenue, there's heavy traffic, there's heavy pedestrians, likely that supervisor is going to discontinue that pursuit if the officer doesn't, because a lot of times in those situations the officer is recognizing that. So there's multiple levels of I guess accountability, but also assessment of these kind of risk factors to try to prevent a negative outcome. And I think that's why there might be other agencies that have, you know, significantly higher chance or fatal collisions or serious injuries during pursuits. We actually have a pretty low amount of fatal collisions with the amount of pursuits that we have also in a dense urban environment. And I think that is because of those risk assessments, and that's because the officers are trained to continuously assess those 19 risk factors. And I think as part of when we were looking to revise the current policy, we were looking if there should be more risk factors, or if we should, combine different ones so that it makes it more efficient for the officers. So that is something to assess. Regarding messaging, I can understand sometimes why officers say that, because people come at us or will react with anger, and appropriately so, because an officer isn't doing, or what they think is not doing something, and that can be really frustrating. And no one wants to be blamed for something that they know they can't learn, that's not necessarily their fault. And I think sometimes that's a reaction. It's a protective reaction of themselves. Like, well, I'm sorry I can't do something because I can't. I try to dissuade people from having that. And then sometimes I try to explain when I'm interacting with people, yes, we didn't get them today. There's other ways that we can try to get this person. Some of that's training, especially when you have newer officers. We have a very young department. They may not understand that nuance when talking to people. So that's something I think we're always working on. But I think that's what leads to a lot of those interactions that you see people put on social media. And it's something we can always look to do better at. So did I miss any aspect of what your question was? Sorry.
No, you did good. And I think the other part of Mr. Alpert, and thank you for answering that. And I'm wondering if, like, public messaging, have you seen that in other cities around, like, the change in policies to really promote, hey, there's a change in, new sheriff in town, for lack of better words. And technically there is, right? We have a new chief. We have an opportunity to kind of change the tide a little bit, at least, even if it's just slight tweaks. I'm telling you, the more we communicate with the public that we're doing something about it, it's going to have a positive reaction of folks. I'm just encouraged. That's more, I guess, more of an encouragement, and wondering if you've seen that in other places, or if you've seen, like, a blanket, and look, I want to give OPD and Lieutenant Urquiza Levin, make sure I get that right. I want to give you all the credit in the world, like, to be able to process those 19 risk factors in real time, and to have the level of injuries that you all have, to have it be that low, is an incredible job. And I don't want to understate how hard that is to be able to process that, right? They said quarterback is the hardest job, man. I'll put that up against a quarterback anytime, a day of the week. So I want to acknowledge that, but I also want to see, how can we make it easier for you all too, to say, like, okay, after 6 o'clock, we could go after people. You know what I mean? And we could still have all these mitigating and these risk factors in our head and clearing it with her. And I love the fact that, you have supervising officers that are clearing that. But I'm just wondering if you've seen in other jurisdictions, like, kind of like a rolling policy, and how public messaging has helped kind of influence that. Sorry.
Let me just make a quick comment about the timing doesn't work, because factories let out at certain times, bars let out at certain times. There are people getting off work, and it's all staggered, so you can't. But look, the 19 factors that Oakland has, they're the traditional ones. You got to balance what you know about this person who's fleeing, not what you think. You can't just assume, because, like you say, they're just some idiots making really bad decisions, who are running from the cops, because, for a variety of reasons. So you don't chase on what you think, you chase on what you know. And I think that's what I assume the policy considers. So then you've got to be careful with that. But the big problem is, once you start chasing someone, how's it going to end? It's only going to end if one of the parties, the fleeing suspect or the officer, terminates. And more likely than not, the fleeing suspect isn't going to terminate until he crashes. So you got to be really careful about the futility of chasing. Someone's got to be the adult in the room, and it's got to be the police officer. So that's got to factor into it. About 15, maybe 20 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, we did a huge project with CalPost, where there are all sorts of documents and all sorts of videos that were made, looking at the pursuit issue. It would be interesting for someone to go back and revisit what CalPost did on pursuits, because I thought it was really good work, looking at the economics, looking at the policy issues, looking at all the things we're talking about. None of this is new, and that's what's so disturbing. I mean, you can see I used to have hair when I first started studying pursuits, and that was a long time ago. We're just recycling the same issues. We haven't come up with an answer. And I think, again, that's where I hope technology, just like the analyst from the Inspector General's office was talking about, AI can now go through all these these issues and figure out what the common patterns are. Well, we've seen departments that require their officers to talk into their body-worn cameras, talking about their decisions. Why are they doing this? Why are they not doing that? Now you have a record of it. And I think that's really important. You do that in training when you're driving. The EBOC courses, you usually talk in what you're doing and explain to your trainer. So why you wouldn't do that in reality when you're dealing with all these 19 factors? And Lieutenant, if your officers can balance those things, well, bless you, because it's a difficult task, and only with good training can you do it. So if they can actually do that in a short period of time, I think that's incredible. So, good on you if most of your officers can do that.
So I will, though, Commissioner Garcia Acosta, add the public messaging to what we are communicating to the Public Safety Committee, that they need to take more action around changes in policy through what the Public Safety Committee, because that's not really the job of the commission, those kind of public messaging, but it is of the Public Safety Committee. Commissioner Jackson, and then Lieutenant Argueza.
Thank you very much. This is a really rich discussion, and I so appreciate Vice Chair Garcia Acosta's comments and challenges. As someone in youth leadership, I know that we as a commission from the very beginning declared that we wanted de-escalation and to value human life within Oakland. And pursuit, sounds like escalation to me. And, Mr. Alpert continues to say, there's really no good end in sight. Without profiling, I guess what I want to understand, and we all got a new education during the pandemic around the age factor of the criminals. And, it wasn't just the 18-year-olds, it was 18 to 30. Who are doing the pursuit? I mean, the takeoff. I understand sometimes it's kids and sometimes it's adults. Do we have any access to the psychological thought process of these criminals? Because I'm with it. You commit a crime, you should do time. But at the end of the day, what I don't expect is for somebody to do a crime that they should go to jail for and they end up dead, or that police officer who's pursuing also ends up dead. Those are not, to me, they are not okay conclusions. The other thing that we also have to net is that while the California Highway Patrol is with us, they don't follow our policies. They follow their own. So what are we looking at in terms of having at least two entities who are policing a city that, are policing as wide range, as they can be, in order to align with whether it's after 8 or after 10 or after 12 or what have you. So those are the things that I'm concerned about. And the new sheriff in town communication piece is real, or at least it could be real, because one of the problems during the pandemic was we were telling everything we were doing. We were doing this intelligence led, and it's like, oh, the crime is over here, so let's mobilize to move over there. And then people would just shift. And that has been, as long as I have been living, I don't want to say criminals are smarter, but they're more agile. And so I'm looking at, where is the psychology in this process? Are there any data points that speak to that? And across the country, is it still kind of 18 to 30, or are 50-year-olds taking off too? So just wanted to know that.
Well,
Go ahead.
I can just say generally it's the young people, and I can't give you a specific age, but yeah, young people flee a lot more frequently than elderly people. And Lieutenant, maybe you can answer this, but in most departments it's young officers. Now, part of it's deployment, where they're assigned and what they do, but for the most part, you age out of chasing. you know, someone, a lot of my friends, not my age, because they've all retired, but you know, older officers aren't going to chase because they want to go home at night. So I think it's a young person's issue, both fleeing and chasing. But Lieutenant, you might have better data on that than I do.
Well, I don't know if I'm the perfect case study because I think I was in more pursuits as a supervisor than I was as an officer, but I might be the odd one out. In our department, it's actually generally the more experienced officers. But that I think there's a litany of reasons for that. But for the most part, a lot of the pursuits that are involve usually the same officers that have a lot of experience related to pursuits, and they're still relatively short. I don't have it right in front of me, but I think it's somewhere around 2.5 minutes. So most of our pursuits are pretty short, and because the officers are more experienced, when they recognize the kind of reckless driving that is going to most likely result in a very negative outcome, that they're pretty good at calling that off.
So wait a minute, I gotta ask a question because I look, if you again train your officers well enough where they'll terminate, good for you, but do the bad guys then think okay, if I flee at higher speeds, they're gonna quit. So does that encourage me to just run and at any expense? So I think that, you know, the messaging, I'm kind of hearing a double standard here where you want to start a chase, but then you say your officers are very good at terminating. What message does that give to the people who want to flee? And look, these are questions, they're not answers.
Yeah, I think that for us, the main point of initiating this pursuit is because it's literally the last resort. So we've looked for outside air, we looked for our own air units. We're trying to find other things, whether it's plainclothes units or, you know, any assets that we have. When all of those are absent, that's when usually the pursuit is initiated. And the goal of the pursuit is to go just long enough to get one of those other entities to help, whether it's, you know, plainclothes, pursuits, and most recently, a lot of times it's the use of stop sticks or spike strips to stop vehicles. And we found that that is usually the best way of stopping the vehicle because it causes the vehicle to travel at a lower speed, and eventually they usually abandon the vehicle because they recognize there's no point in further flight. So those are generally the goals for what a pursuit leads to. So it's not, our goal is not to have the pursuit end by the car wrapping itself around a tree, because that's not an outcome that anybody is looking for. And then usually when it's recognized that, you know, further pursuit isn't likely to lead to their apprehension, that's generally when they've been broken off. I know pursuits that I've been involved in, when it's gotten to, you know, 3 or 4 minutes long and they start driving excess or more and more recklessly, that's when I'm doing an assessment, and it's at that point it's not worth it, and I don't have something that's going to be overhead soon to assist me. And likely the only way they're going to stop is crashing. And then on that particular pursuit, that car later crashed into a telephone pole on its own, you know, 20-30 minutes later. So that kind of stuff happens. So that I guess that's what I wanted to emphasize is often we are looking to disable the vehicle in a manner that will lead to the apprehension of the actual suspects. And then when we were talking about the age of the actual people who are fleeing, I mean, I've seen anything from 13 and 14-year-olds all the way up to 40 and 50-year-olds. Often a lot of our robbery crews are younger, so a lot of the people that we end up pursuing are younger, because our biggest issue that we have in the city is robbery and carjackings. So most of our pursuits surround robberies and carjackings. But there have been other incidents with people armed with firearms or shooting or homicide vehicles. Those tend to be a little bit older, but they also do involve very young people.
But you're mentioning every crime you've mentioned is a violent crime. So that would be consistent, as I understand it, with your policy that would allow you to initiate.
No, most of those are basically everything he mentioned. It would be a non-pursuit, like no burglary, residential burglary of any sort, non-pursuit.
He said robbery, he didn't say burglary.
Well,
I don't-
so what I should clarify, and then this is kind of, I think, what's changed a lot about Oakland. A lot of the crimes that lead to the funding for the proliferation of firearms is commercial burglaries, and then up into robbery. what I think a lot of criminals have gotten involved in is crimes that they think that they're not going to be prosecuted for or chased for. So we've seen commercial burglaries, accelerate, and in the manner of which these commercial burglaries are committed are extreme compared to the way that they used to be committed, and often in the possession of firearms. So that is one of the issues that we kind of have a void in addressing, because we don't always know that they're armed with firearms, but often these crews are armed with firearms, in up into including the case where we had an officer get killed because they were trying to commit a burglary and they were armed with firearms, and they reacted the way they reacted. So it's difficult because a lot of the crimes that we normally would be chasing for are present. We're just not aware of them until after the event, and the money is being spent towards firearms, which then get used in shootings and homicides. And interrupting that cycle of violence before it gets to that level is the part that I think is the most
Yeah,
important.
but Lieutenant, that's a crapshoot. You can't be chasing for something that you think they might have a firearm. If you have reasonable suspicion, if that's what your policy or statute allows, or probable cause, that's one thing. But just thinking they might, you don't want to put people at risk on a whim. You got to have some reason.
Well, I should clarify. I believe that the policy that we had, the one that we've had since 2014, is a pretty good starting point of robbery and up. I think in most cases, especially during the day when there's a lot of people out, or there's high traffic or high pedestrian traffic, that's a pretty good start. But when everybody knows that's that's the hard stop, that's what can tend to lead to other things happening. So whether that void is filled with technology, whether that void is filled with the way that those cases are prosecuted, that's what we are trying to figure out here. The answer might not be pursuits, but starting with the conclusion of pursuits are bad, I think is not necessarily the best way to start a conversation when we're just trying to figure out what we can do. And then just completely ruling something out because it might not work or hasn't worked in another city, I think is probably the wrong starting point.
I don't disagree with you, and I'm not against pursuits. I'm against pursuits for minor offenses. I think the ones you had mentioned, the robberies, the violent crimes, the carjackings, I think you have the justification to raise risk to the public, and we've done public opinion surveys where the public would agree that if something happened to them or their family based on a high level crime, rape, robbery, murder, they're not going to like it, obviously, but they'd understand it better than if it were for a motor vehicle violation or a stolen car. So
Agreed.
I think that balance has to be understood.
Agreed, but I think the thing and I think this is important to bring in the community to this, is a lot of the community is frustrated because people's livelihoods are being taken, not necessarily them being robbed or them being shot. It's their businesses are being taken, and businesses are leaving, jobs are leaving, people are leaving, and people are losing their livelihoods, and that is important to factor in. It's a lot harder to look at that. That's not something you can easily get statistics for, but overall, from everybody, or I wouldn't say everybody, for most of the people that I interact with, they're concerned about that just as much as they're concerned about the shootings, sometimes more, because in a lot of these communities, they're not dealing with shootings within their neighborhoods, but they are dealing with businesses leaving, they're dealing with people leaving the city. And there's all kinds of downstream stuff from that, the tax revenue coming in, whether that's going to schools, whether that's going to public safety. And we're seeing it with our current budget situation. So I get that it doesn't, at face value, chasing somebody for doing a burglary of a store doesn't seem like it's worth it. But being able to stop people from breaking into stores is important. And how do we address it? How do we figure that out? And it's a difficult question. It has a difficult answer.
Totally agree with your logic. I just don't agree with the pursuing and putting people's lives at risk is the way to do it. And I think we probably are closer in agreement than disagreement. How you get there is the problem. And there's so many is way beyond just policing. It has to do with a lot of things, including budgets and dealing with crimes like you're talking about, property crimes. How do you deter them? And letting someone just break into a store and snatch and grab and run not do anything about it is not the way to go. I totally agree with that. I just, you know, as someone who studied pursuits for so long, I just don't think that's the answer.
Appreciate that, and we're trying to look at other ways. That's kind of one of the things that we're going to be recommending. Did I see Captain Osmus have her hand up, Lisa?
Hi, good evening. Let me see if I can do video too. There we go. Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Captain Lisa Osmus. I'm one of the captains, obviously, for the Oakland Police Department, and I chair the pursuit boards. Just a quick summary. And I agree with what everybody's saying, and Lieutenant Urquiza as well is putting it all together. I did do a comprehensive comparative analysis. Thank you, Joseph, for assisting with that for policies in the area with the different agencies. I have two more I'd like to add, and then I'm just going to send this out to the commissioners so you guys can kind of see what the surrounding agencies, neighboring agencies actually allowed to pursue for, what their policies entail, and just kind of give you an idea of what you're looking at overall. Maybe just be more informative of what's happening just for the other Bay Area agencies. And I think it might help make decisions as we go through this to figure out what's best for Oakland and how to pursue it. So I just want to add those 2 cents, and then I try and answer any other questions if you need.
Okay, thank you. Joseph?
Yeah, so this is just very brief. We talked about like pursuits being terminated very quickly. Do you know, like, even just like roughly offhand, what percentage of pursuits end in an arrest, end in a suspect being apprehended?
Sorry, was that for OPD or for?
Yeah, OPD.
I think I just did a presentation on this. It was somewhere around 25%. I think we're at 26% this year to date, which is actually significantly higher than most cities or most agencies that I looked at. But it's usually somewhere around 25%. We dropped when they first inserted the 50-mile-per-hour policy, that dropped down significantly, and then also firearm recoveries dropped. But this year, I think there's been a lot more comfort among the watch commanders approving 50 over. So actually the pursuit speeds went up when the basically that hard, or I guess soft cap came in, which is an interesting statistic and doesn't quite make any sense.
Makes you wonder how much the cap is really accomplishing.
Exactly. But since we've seen more of the pursuits over 50 being approved, that number of apprehensions has actually gone up. And I would say a lot of times pursuits are even mitigated from the beginning if we have air assets up. So that number is probably significantly higher for cars that normally would be pursued, but then were detained by other means.
Lieutenant, what of that 25%, how many of those were involved in a collision?
I can pull up. I don't want to hold everybody up. I do have the stats that I compiled for a presentation. So let me grab that real quick, and then I'll.
Yeah, I remember it being like 4 injuries or death in the last 3 years, something like that.
I believe it was 3 since 2018. We had 2 in 1 year, and then another year with 1. I'll also have to verify that exactly, so don't hold me to that. But I believe it was 3 since 2018. It's either 3 or 4.
Are those fatalities?
Those are fatalities. I believe
that's really low. That's a good number. No one likes a fatality, but statistically, that's really low.
And I believe 2 of those were 1 incident, right?
There was 2 in. I'll pull up the numbers and I'll have a more educated response.
So there was an additional question in the chat about pursuing motorcycles. Is it true that motorcycles are not pursued in Oakland's policies?
I believe as a matter of routine, it would not be. I'm sure there would be extenuating circumstances that it may happen, but as a general rule, the pursuits of motorcycles is prohibited just based on the likelihood that will end in a fatality if they collide with anything.
Okay. Thank you. Well, this has been great, and I think we're coming near the end. What I'm hearing is that generally, with some changes that I've heard tonight, the report is generally accepted from the ad hoc committee. I will add some of these suggestions to tonight about public messaging, greater emphasis on the technology side of it, and that the council also fund a study on the specifics of Oakland's pursuit policy around who's running away and some of the psychology on that side. Am I to understand that from those who are participating here?
I think you need to understand the data before you can come up with a really good solution. So I think not only do the national data need to be updated, certainly to know what's going on. And from what I hear from Lieutenant and the captain, that you guys are doing a pretty good job. So with that data, you know, you may be different from other cities. So, and with the training, I don't know anything about your training anymore. So if you are training your officers well and they are terminating quickly, then you may be in much better shape. But I think you're right, sir. I think that you need to look at the data to answer that question.
Great. Lieutenant Urquiza, and then Commissioner Garcia Costa. Okay, there's your information. Okay.
I don't know why that moved it all over the place. I was trying to get off of mute. Yeah, so I just pulled this up and I can also send this to you, Professor. So this was 2022, I believe, to 2024, but 2022 was 130 pursuits. There was 2 level 1s. That's a pursuit that resulted in a fatality. There was 26 level 2s. That's the where a vehicle collided with either another vehicle or an inanimate object. In most cases, it's an inanimate object or a parked car, and that was in roughly 20% of the incidents. For injuries of third-party subjects, that's people who were not involved in the pursuit. There was 2 in that year, and both were complaints of pain. So those were not severe injuries to non-involved persons. And then the person that was a subject of pursuit, so the person that was driving the suspect vehicle, was 1 severe, which was a pelvic fracture. 1 was a minor laceration, and then 2 complaints of pain. And then, so yeah, there was 34 in custody out of the 130 pursuits. So it was 26% for in custody rate for that year, with 15 firearms recovered, an average speed of 58 miles per hour. I'll breeze to the other. 2023, I think is when the 50 mile per hour policy came into place. You see pursuits dropped. There was no level 1, so no pursuits resulted in fatality. 11 level 2s, which are pursuits that resulted in a collision with either another vehicle or an inanimate object, which was down to 12%. And then there was 1 injury to third-party subjects, so someone not involved. And then for those who were being pursued, 2 minor abrasions, 2 moderate injuries, so a collision involved with a patrol vehicle colliding into a fence. And like I said, the pursuit or the in custody level dropped on the 14%, 5 firearms recovered, and the average speed went up to 60 miles per hour. And then just 2024 year to date was 38 total pursuits, no fatal pursuits, 6 collisions, so 16%, 2 non-involved subjects injured, and then it looks like 4 subjects that were pursued that were injured. For 2 were minor injuries, and then 2 complaints of pains, and then 9 in custody out of the 38, 24%, with 3 firearms recovered, and then the speed increased again to 65.6%. So that's just there. And then just for the group, this was the sheriff's office from 2021, which is 162 total pursuits. Again, they did have a different policy than we do. They've since had a more restrictive policy, but 162 pursuits, 101 felonies, 41 misdemeanors, 21 infractions. They had 20 arrest instances, which is 12%. The 78 pursuits terminated by the deputy, with 51 terminated by their supervisor. 14 of those pursuits related in collisions, so 8% of their pursuits. 2 subjects from the pursued vehicles were injured, and 4 uninvolved parties were injured. And then they had no pursuits resulting in a collision leading to fatality. So I think that is the data from ours, but I did look back to 2018, and we did not have, I think it was 2018, 2019. We did not have any fatal collisions, but I don't have the injury statistics in front of me.
Okay.
Let me just say that those data are really impressive compared to most of the cities that I've looked at in the last few years. So you know, you guys are doing something right.
Very good. Very good. Any other comments from any of the ad hoc members? So
I
go
have
ahead.
I have a question, Commissioner Riles.
Yes.
Lieutenant Urquiza Lieben, is that the document you shared for the public forum?
Yes,
Okay,
it's from the same presentation.
perfect. So to the community, that document and other resources can be found on our website under the Community Policing Ad Hoc. So I've put those resources there along with the resource that Professor Alpert shared or discussed this evening.
So I will redraft that, a second draft of the review report, and that will be brought before the commission at our special meeting on the 19th. Is that right, Ms. Montgomery?
That is correct, sir.
All right, and then the commission will make a final decision on what then is submitted to the Public Safety Committee of the City Council, which is another opportunity for folks to comment and participate. And then the Public Safety Committee will make a recommendation to the full council after that. So we may be able to get through this before the end of September. Thank you all for participating. And so I'm going to call in, unless you have a comment, Commissioner Acosta, you still have your hand up there.
Can I
I'm
say
sorry,
one
man.
thing, sir? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, excuse me. Sorry, I just realized my hand is camouflaged in this painting, man. So I wasn't sure if you saw it for quite some time. The one thing I did want to say, and thank you for sharing those data points. They're quite fascinating actually, because if you notice, the less you pursue, right, the less you had people taken off, but the faster people were driving year to year. So that part was pretty fascinating to look at. I think we need to chew on that a little bit. And I was wondering, actually, I originally had my hands up because I was going to ask about non-fatal injuries. So thanks for sharing that data as well. But I think the last data point that I want us to explore, because it's very relevant to Oakland, and I'm wondering if OPD is tracking this. If not, maybe we could include this in part of this study of what's going on in Oakland, is how many folks that are taking off in these pursuits are not even residents from Oakland.
Good point.
Because what we know from the sideshows and with social media, that all kinds of people meet up from all kinds of jurisdictions from all over the place to Oakland. And I think part of the optics and the actions we have to take are also to be able to tell the public that we're curving the idea that other folks that come from other cities into Oakland and commit crimes and have that type of criminal behavior here in Oakland. So very interested to see how many of those arrests are coming from, or those people that are taken off from sideshow. What we know from sideshows, that a lot of people are coming from out of town. Anyway, that's the only point I want to make. And thank you very much for this.
Thank you.
Fruitful dialogue.
Let me add one reference for you. Chief Jason Potts of Las Vegas City Police Department probably knows more about sideshows and has dealt with them. And I can't remember where he was in California before he went to Las Vegas, but he'd be an excellent resource to talk to about how to deal with sideshows. I've seen his presentations before and his information. He's spot on. He'd be a good reference for you.
Thank you.
And if
And I'm
I could
happy,
just, sorry, go ahead.
Commissioner, I'm happy to Do you know him, Lieutenant?
No, sorry, I
You're-
didn't mean to interrupt you. I thought you were finished with your thought.
No,
It's
I was just gonna say,
growing
I'm
pains
happy to
of Zoom.
happy to send his reference if anyone wants it.
Yes, please send it to me.
Okay,
What I was gonna offer for those that are in Oakland, if anybody does want to go out on a ride along, I am more than happy to take anyone out and so you can see firsthand kind of what they're dealing with, or what officers are dealing with, and also kind of the atmosphere that we're working within. And you might be surprised, or it might show you what you already know, but I think it's always important, and I'm always happy to take anybody out and go wherever they want to go and do whatever they want to do. So I think all of my emails in the thread that we have for this group. So feel free to reach out, and I'll make make it work.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lieutenant. All right, let's see. Thank you all very much. And we may see some of you on the 19th at the full commission meeting. Thank you all. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you,
All right,
Professor.
thank you.